Three of the most powerful civilizations that ever existed on this planet were destroyed by the same thing. Not by a more powerful army, not by famine or plague, not by internal collapse or bad leadership, by a single metal. A metal so soft you can scratch it with your fingernail. A metal you cannot eat, cannot sharpen into a weapon, cannot burn for warmth. By any practical measure, a rock off the ground is more useful. And yet, across 2 centuries, every civilization that had enough of it ended up wishing it didn't. The question isn't why this metal became valuable. The question is how something this useless became this lethal, and why the more of it you had, the more certainly you would be erased. Let's start in 1324, with a man whose name most people don't recognize, but whose single journey may have set more of subsequent history in motion than almost any military campaign in the medieval era. Mansa Musa was the emperor of the Mali Empire in West Africa. His personal wealth, adjusted for today, has been estimated at over $400 billion, a figure so large that historians have generally stopped trying to compare him to anyone else and simply called him the richest individual in human history. And in 1324, he decided to fulfill his religious obligation to make the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca. He just did it in a way the world had never seen. His caravan crossed the Sahara with 60,000 people. 500 of his personal heralds walked ahead of him, each one carrying a staff made entirely of this metal, each weighing 6 pounds. 80 camels followed, each loaded with up to 300 pounds of it in dust form. And as this procession moved through Cairo, Mansa Musa did what extraordinarily wealthy rulers sometimes did. He gave. He handed it to mosques, to the poor, to merchants, to anyone who came near him. He spent so freely and so generously that he flooded the Egyptian economy with more of this metal than it could absorb in a generation, and its value across North Africa and the Middle East collapsed overnight. Egypt's economy took over 12 years to recover from Mansa Musa simply passing through. But here's the thing. Egypt eventually recovered, and Mansa Musa went home with his empire entirely intact. So if his pilgrimage caused an economic crisis, and he still came home safely, how did this single journey trigger a catastrophe that would destroy civilizations he never even visited? Because the stories traveled west. By 1375, European cartographers were publishing maps of West Africa that had previously been filled with imaginary animals to hide the fact that European mapmakers had no idea what was actually there. Now those maps showed something specific. A king seated on a throne made of this metal, holding a nugget of it the size of his fist, with text noting he was the richest and most noble lord in all the land. The maps were not subtle. They were an advertisement. And a generation of European explorers read them the same way Cortez would later read Montezuma's gifts, not as a warning to stay away, but as a set of directions. Mansa Musa's pilgrimage didn't conquer anything. It announced. And the announcement turned out to be far more dangerous than any army. But that is not the moment the fuse catches. That is the moment it's lit. And before we go any further, the metal has a name. It is gold. Soft, useless, impractical gold. And knowing that name should make what happens next feel even stranger. Because what you're about to hear is not a story about a weapon. It's a story about a decorative object that people decided at some point was worth crossing oceans and ending civilizations to own. To find the explosion, you have to go to Mexico, 1519, where a Spanish soldier named Hernan Cortez is approaching the greatest city in the Western Hemisphere, and a man named Montezuma II is about to make the most catastrophic diplomatic miscalculation in recorded history. Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire, was built on an island in the middle of a lake. It had canals instead of streets, towers, aqueducts carrying fresh water across the water itself. By most estimates, it held 250,000 people, making it larger than any city in Europe at the time. Cortez himself, who had every reason to minimize what he saw, described it in letters back to Spain as the most beautiful thing in the world. Montezuma ruled the city at the height of its power, and when Cortez arrived on the coast with 600 soldiers, Montezuma made a decision that made complete sense from inside the logic of every diplomatic tradition he had ever known. He sent gifts, extraordinary gifts. Golden jewelry, sacred objects his craftsmen had spent years creating. A sun disk of solid gold so large it required several men to carry. A wheel of silver the same size. Feathered headdresses embedded with gold. Objects Cortez's own officers would later describe as having no artistic equal in Europe. This was not weakness. This was a display of power. Every previous enemy Montezuma had ever neutralized with tribute understood exactly what this meant. We are rich enough to give this away. So imagine what we still have. Go home. Montezuma had used this logic his entire reign, and it had worked. But it had never before encountered Hernan Cortez. Cortez read those gifts the way a predator reads blood in water. Every golden object that arrived was not evidence of power, but evidence of supply. Not a reason to leave, but a reason to stay. He wrote back to the King of Spain describing streets lined with gold, temples covered in it, storehouses full of it. And within 2 years, the city that Montezuma had built into the greatest urban achievement in the hemisphere was rubble. The island was razed. The canals were filled in. The temples were demolished stone by stone. Cortez had his men melt every golden object they could find into uniform ingots, ceremonial masks, sacred figures. Generations of artistic achievement reduced to metal bars that could be weighed and shipped. He built his own palace directly on top of the ruins of Montezuma's. Mexico City still stands on that foundation today. Now, here's the question that the destruction of Tenochtitlan immediately raises. The Aztec Empire had enemies, people who had been conquered by the Aztecs, who resented paying tribute to Tenochtitlan, who actively helped Cortez because they thought replacing one ruler with another couldn't possibly be worse. They were wrong. Because the Spanish didn't come to rule the way the Aztecs had. They came for the gold. And once the Aztecs were gone, every other civilization that had gold was now visible on the map in a way it had never been before. Which brings us to Atahualpa. By 1532, the Inca Empire stretched over 4,000 miles along the western coast of South America. It was the largest empire in the world. Its ruler, Atahualpa, had just won a brutal civil war against his own brother and was at the absolute height of his power. When Francisco Pizarro arrived with 168 men, Atahualpa agreed to meet him. He brought thousands of his own soldiers. He had 80,000 battle-hardened troops in the surrounding hills. He had, by any rational military calculation, absolutely nothing to fear from 168 strangers with unfamiliar weapons. Pizarro ambushed the meeting. His men opened fire with artillery into a crowd of unarmed attendants. Cavalry charged through thousands of people who had never seen a horse. In less than an hour, 5,000 Inca soldiers were dead. Atahualpa was captured. Pizarro had suffered exactly one injury during the entire ambush, a cut on his own hand, sustained while preventing his soldiers from accidentally killing Atahualpa in the chaos, because Atahualpa alive was worth more than Atahualpa dead. And then Atahualpa made the offer. Sitting in his cell, he looked around the room he was held in. The room was 22 feet long, 17 feet wide. He stood up, stretched his arm above his head, and drew a line on the wall. He said, "I will fill this room with gold up to that line, within 2 months." He gestured to indicate he would fill 2 adjacent rooms with silver as the same ransom. Pizarro agreed immediately. And for the next 2 months, Inca runners crossed thousands of miles of mountain terrain to strip temples, pull gold from sacred sites across the entire length of the empire, and carry it back to fill the room. They filled it. The total, after being melted into ingots, amounted to over 1.3 million pesos de oro, worth more than $500 million in modern currency. Atahualpa had delivered everything he promised. Pizarro executed him anyway. The charges at his formal trial included idolatry, polygamy, and inciting rebellion. The real reason was simpler and more brutal. A free Atahualpa, able to command millions of subjects across thousands of miles, was not a defeated enemy. He was an existential threat to everything Pizarro was beginning to understand he could take. The gold hadn't bought Atahualpa's freedom. It had simply confirmed to Pizarro exactly what else was still out there to take. Put the three stories side by side, and the pattern becomes almost impossible to miss. Mansa Musa displayed his gold during a religious journey and accidentally drew European attention to an entire continent. Montezuma sent gold as a diplomatic signal of power, and it functioned as the opposite of everything he intended. Atahualpa paid a ransom in gold that was the highest ever offered in human history and was executed the moment the payment was complete. In every case, gold did not buy safety. In every case, gold did the same specific thing. It told people who were willing to use unlimited violence exactly where to look next. The metal didn't start the wars directly. It did something more insidious. It made extraordinary civilizations visible to people who saw visibility as an invitation. And every civilization that had enough gold to be noticed paid for the noticing in ways that had nothing to do with the gold itself. So here's what I actually want to know from you. If three of the most powerful civilizations in the world were destroyed not by military weakness, not by disease alone, not by internal collapse, but specifically because they had something other people wanted badly enough to cross oceans for, what does that tell you about what actually makes a civilization vulnerable? Tell me in the comments. And don't just say greed is human nature, because greed existed before gold. Actually think about what it is specifically about gold: its visibility, its permanence, its uselessness for everything except wanting, that made it capable of ending things that armies and droughts and plagues sometimes couldn't. I'll see you in the next one.